Week 3 is in the book, so that means it's time to hit those waiver wires to find players that could add value to the back end of your rosters. And first and foremost, I want to highlight a few players that are already highly rostered, but not exactly 100% that I think need to be, and that includes Jake Browning, quarterback for the Cincinnati Bengals, Carson Wentz, quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings, Marcus Mariota, quarterback for the Washington Commanders, Tyrod Taylor, quarterback for the New York Jets, Chris Rodriguez and Jeremy McNichols, running backs for the Washington Commanders, Trey Tucker, wide receiver for the Vegas Raiders, Dontavian Wicks, wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers, and Cole Kmet, tight end for the Chicago Bears. Again, all these guys are rostered in well over 90% of Dynasty leagues out there, but not exactly 100%. So double check your waiver wires and immediately add these guys if they are available. Now, in a very injury-laden week, all is quiet on the quarterback front after last week's massacres to the position. So outside of checking your waiver wires for Jake Browning, Carson Wentz, and the other guys who actually started this week, I might also recommend hitting waivers for Brett Rypien, who is the new backup to Jake Browning and actually got playing time at the end of the blowout loss to Minnesota this week. We all expected Jake Browning to be good after his 2023 performance in Joe Burrow's place, but it is possible that Jake Browning just doesn't have it this time. He's a backup quarterback for a reason, and maybe he gets benched or even injured himself at some point throughout the remainder of the year, in which case Rypien would actually get the starting role. Now, whether that's actually relevant for us for fantasy, if we actually want to start him, I don't really know, because I don't think Rypien is all that good either, but it's at least a potential starting quarterback with great weapons around him, all the same arguments that we're making for Jake Browning, so who knows. I would also add on to that if any backup quarterbacks are still on waivers in your Superflex leagues, especially the backups to your own starters, speaking from experience as somebody who lost Joe Burrow and lost Jaden Daniels this week and did not have Mariota or Jake Browning, and I had to figure something else out, it would probably be wise to see if you could stash these backup quarterbacks on your bench, whether you have them or not, but especially if you have their starters. That includes, but is not limited to, Malik Willis, Joe Milton, Tanner McKee, Tyson Bagent, Mitch Trubisky, Jimmy Garoppolo, Trey Lance, Zach Wilson, and Quinn Ewers behind Tua, Mason Rudolph and Will Howard behind Aaron Rodgers, Nick Mullins, Joshua Dobbs, Jacoby Brissett, Andy Dalton, and I'm sure there's even a couple others who could be interesting to stash just in case of future injuries or even possible benchings as the season goes along. Now, let's get into the big injuries on the week, because this week sucked for injuries, starting with the horrible injury to James Conner that I imagine ends his season, or at the very least keeps him off the field for quite some time. Obviously, Trey Benson is the big beneficiary, and he is rostered in every single Dynasty league out there, but the new handcuffs to Trey Benson are Amari DiMarcado and Bam or Zonovan Knight. I think he changed his name to actually Bam Knight. That was his nickname, but I think he actually changed his name to that. So when you're looking for waivers, if you are trying to add Knight, it's either going to be Bam Knight or Zonovan Knight. We have seen both of these running backs in action over the past couple of years, so there really isn't any future analysis to speak on them other than they could just be one injury away from a major role for fantasy football. My preference is Amari DiMarcado, but I'm not opposed to adding Knight either, just in case, especially if you play in super deep leagues. Now, the other major injury this week for running backs was Najee Harris's torn Achilles, an injury that always grosses me out when they show it on replays, and he will 100% be done for the remainder of the year. Omarion Hampton looked phenomenal this week, and he is going to be the bell cow RB1 for the Chargers moving forward, but the new handcuff behind him is Hassan Haskins, the former Michigan Wolverine and Tennessee Titan. We've only seen Haskins a few times in his career for actually meaningful snaps, the last time being week 18 last year with the Chargers when he rushed for 33 yards and a touchdown on 12 carries, splitting work behind J.K. Dobbins. He's really nothing special, but in this high-powered Chargers offense, should anything happen to Omarion Hampton, Haskins could have a major role as their RB1. Now, moving on to the wide receiver injuries, the big one this week was to CeeDee Lamb, who reportedly missed on a major ankle injury, and he himself, I think, has actually said that he could play this week, but it is an ankle injury, and he maybe could miss time if the Cowboys wanted to be a little bit more cautious with it. George Pickens will get the wide receiver 1 role for Dak Prescott. Jake Ferguson seemed to be a massive winner with Lamb off the field, but behind them comes Kevontae Turpin and Jalen Tolbert. Now, I actually highlighted Turpin in last week's video, so if you followed that advice, you actually beat the waiver wire a week early, and people in your league might wonder if you can actually see the future. I actually think that Jalen Tolbert would be the main winner as the more typical wide receiver on the team, as he actually saw 6 targets on Sunday, good for third on the team behind Pickens and Ferguson. Then Turpin would still stay in his more kind of gadgety role, but both of them could see an increase in snaps and targets without CeeDee Lamb on the field, so they are guys to add and just see what happens, both with the severity of Lamb's injury and their usage on the field without him. Mike Evans then also left the game early with a hamstring injury, and as Chris Godwin is still ramping up from his injury last year, the most actionable waiver ad for the week in all formats could honestly be Sterling Shepard, who has been playing the wide receiver 3 role without Godwin or Jalen McMillan on the field and has been pretty productive in that role on limited targets. This week, he actually had 4 receptions for 80 yards on 5 targets, so should Evans and Godwin be out next week, Shepard will get a very valuable wide receiver 2 role across from Emeka Egbuka for Baker Mayfield against the Philadelphia Eagles, who have been torched by Puka Nacua and CeeDee Lamb already this year, so it's possible that with Baker needing to throw more in what could be a high-scoring game, Shepard could actually be a very sneaky start this week in Week 4. Not to mention that should Evans and Godwin also be out for Week 5, bye weeks are starting to come into play, and if you have any Falcons, Bears, Packers, or Steelers wide receivers that you're counting on, you may need a spot start from Sterling Shepard in 2 weeks in Week 5 as well. So do not ignore him if he's on waivers, which according to my data, he's available in a ton of Dynasty leagues, like 70% of Dynasty leagues. He's available out there, at least on MFL. So do not ignore Sterling Shepard. I also added rookie Tez Johnson to the list this week just as a potential stash in deeper leagues if the Evans injury is severe enough and Godwin is also slow to come back. Tez was a productive player at Oregon last year, and even though he fell to day 3 in the draft this year, he is of enough interest as Baker's possible wide receiver 3 for a couple of weeks to be rostered just to see what happens. The last major injury this week was to Terry McLaurin, leaving with a quad injury, and actually as I am scripting out this video, I've seen like no updates post-game about Terry McLaurin's injury, so you're going to have to check as the next couple of days go by to see what is actually happening with Terry McLaurin. Should he miss time, Deebo Samuel's the wide receiver 1, Zach Ertz gets a bump 2, then behind them is a conglomerate of Jalen Lane, Luke McCaffrey, and Noah Brown, who also is currently injured and missed Week 3, but it's possible that Noah Brown plays in Week 4. McCaffrey was actually the most productive player this week with Marcus Mariota, catching 3 passes for 56 yards and a touchdown, so he might be the most interesting name to add here, especially if Noah Brown doesn't play next week. Jalen Lane is still kind of getting integrated into this offense as a day 3 rookie, but could have relevance if Terry McLaurin misses time. And then Noah Brown had weeks last year as kind of the more wide receiver 2 for Jaden Daniels, where he had very relevant fantasy performances. So if he is healthy, he could be the more go-to target for Jaden Daniels next week. Honestly, I'm really not sure where to go here if McLaurin were to actually miss time. The actual answer may be that none of them are relevant, and then Deebo and Zach Ertz are the real winners here. But if I had to pick my order, it honestly would be Noah Brown, Luke McCaffrey, then Jalen Lane for immediate production, assuming Noah Brown returns next week. If we somehow know he's not going to practice again this week before Wednesday, before waivers run, then go for Luke McCaffrey. Now, the second most actionable waiver ad this week in terms of actually entering your starting lineup straight off of waivers might be Jaguars receiver Parker Washington, because this is now 2 weeks of strong usage and production as the entire Jaguars offense continues to struggle and figure things out with Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter. Last week, Washington put up 76 yards on 5 catches. Then this week, while only having 34 yards on 4 catches, he did see a team-high 11 targets. Now, why is this happening? I have no idea, but it is just happening right now. 2 weeks is enough for me to take note and add him on waivers just to see what is actually going on in Jacksonville. I would also mention that Dyami Brown left the game early with a shoulder injury, so if he is out for an extended time, that shrinks the pie in Jacksonville for targets to go to where we would assume it would help BTJ and Travis Hunter, but in reality, at least what happened this past Sunday, that benefited Parker Washington. Now, the final ad of the week, if he is available in your league, and fans of this YouTube channel would have already had him rostered all summer because I was harping on him all draft season, it is Chargers rookie tight end Oronde Gadsden. I was tempted to just add him to the end of the double check section of this article, as I did back before week 1, as stashes to add before the season started, because he is the most rostered player on this list today at 90% rostered. But the usage this week was nothing short of encouraging that I had to highlight him in this video. 7 targets, tied for 3rd on the team this week, 5 receptions, 46 yards. Will Dissly was inactive this week, and most people thought that that would mean an increase in usage for Tyler Conklin, but nope. It was my dude Oronde Gadsden getting work this week. The reason we haven't seen him prior to this week was because he was a healthy scratch in each of the first 2 games as the Chargers tight end 3 behind Conklin and Disley. Then Disley's injury bumped Gadsden up to the game day roster. But all summer, we have heard that Jim Harbaugh loves this kid. He had a bunch of training camp hype, and all he needed was a chance to show what he can do in an actual game, and we got that this week. The hope now moving forward is that Gadsden has now climbed over Disley as a starting tight end on game days, and then he can also solidify his position as the tight end 1 on the team over Tyler Conklin as well, like we saw this week. So if he is still available in your league, he is 100% a must-add. Now all we need is to get Phil Maffa healthy and playing ahead of Miles Sanders and then showing that he's better than Javonte Williams, and it's all going according to plan.